Welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we are actually looking at something incredibly specific. It comes directly from a single patch of dirt.
Yeah, literally a garden patch.
Right. It's this intimately detailed journal entry number 901 to be exact, from a gardener named Ang. It's dated May 21, 2026.
Which is just a remarkable document on its own.
Oh, absolutely. And the mission for us today, for you listening, is to explore what is basically a masterclass in how to recognize, anticipate, and adapt to sudden environmental shifts. We're looking at what it takes to survive climatic whiplash.
Climatic whiplash is the perfect way to put it. And, just reaching part 901 of a gardening journal implies this level of daily, almost microscopic observation that most of us just never apply to anything.
Yeah, it's not abstract theory.
Exactly. Ang isn't relying on theories. This is pure, distilled, lived experience. And the environmental context Ang is documenting here is incredibly stark.
Because they've been dealing with a lot of rain, right?
A massive amount. This garden has just come out of a deeply saturated rainy season. Ang describes it as, quote, moons of heavy downpours.
Which sets up the core tension perfectly. The environment has been effectively submerged.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you think about an athlete training for a marathon, right? It's as if they have spent the last 6 months running entirely underwater.
Wow, yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Their body, their muscles, their oxygen intake, everything is completely optimized for the resistance, the lack of gravity, and the constant overwhelming saturation of that specific environment.
But the forecast is about to change all of that.
Exactly. The weather forecasts are predicting that the El Niño phenomenon is going to hit somewhere between June and July.
And to really grasp the severity of that shift, we have to look at the mechanics of El Niño.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, in a broad sense, it involves the warming of surface waters in the equatorial Pacific, which completely scrambles global atmospheric circulation. But for Ang's specific microclimate, it means the atmospheric faucet is about to be violently shut off.
Just completely closed.
Yep. The typical weather patterns that deliver those moons of downpours will be displaced by a persistent high-pressure system.
So it's not a gradual change?
No, not at all. The transition won't be a gentle fading of the rain. It's going to be a drastic pivot to scorching, dry heat that will last for months. It stretches all the way until the monsoon season finally returns at the end of the year.
So our underwater runner is going to be suddenly airlifted and dropped right into the middle of a desert and expected to just keep running.
And they are wearing the completely wrong gear.
Right. The streamlined suit they wore to cut through the water is now going to, trap the desert heat and cause heat stroke. The rules of survival don't just change, they completely invert.
They do.
But you don't just wake up one day and find yourself in a desert. There are always leading indicators if you know how to read the landscape.
And that is arguably the most compelling observation in this entire journal entry.
The canary in the garden.
Exactly. The macro weather pattern of El Niño hasn't even officially arrived yet. It's still late May. But the microenvironment of the garden is already reacting.
The plants are feeling it first.
They are. They feel the ambient shift before the meteorologists even declare the season changed. And Ang points to a very specific casualty experiencing this firsthand.
The Brazilian spinach.
The Brazilian spinach.
Which, when you look closely at the notes, it doesn't seem like the Brazilian spinach is inherently a weak or fragile plant.
No, not inherently.
Right, so why the Brazilian spinach? What makes certain elements of an ecosystem react to a shift before everything else does? It seems like it's a structural issue. Ang explicitly mentions that the plants feeling the change firsthand are the ones living in shallow soil and potting mixes with high drainage.
That's the key right there.
So is this essentially an issue of root depth and physical exposure?
It is entirely an issue of infrastructure and physics. Shallow pots have a very high surface area to volume ratio.
Meaning there's a lot of exposed dirt.
Right. Because there isn't a deep reservoir of earth to insulate the roots, the soil temperature in a shallow pot fluctuates wildly based on the air around it.
Oh, I see.
So before the severe heat of El Niño even fully sets in, the ambient humidity in the air begins to drop. The atmosphere gets thirsty, essentially.
And it comes looking for water.
Exactly. And because that shallow soil is so exposed, the dry air begins pulling moisture directly out of the dirt at an accelerated rate.
So the spinach is acting as an exposed nerve for the entire garden. It feels the invisible drop in atmospheric moisture first.
Precisely. It is highly sensitive to the specific environmental variable that is currently shifting.
Okay, let's unpack the second part of Eng's observation, because this is where the logic gets really interesting.
The drainage piece.
Yeah, the vulnerable plants are in shallow soil, yes. But Eng also specifies they are in a potting mix designed with high drainage. Let's test the logic there. If the soil is draining too fast and drying out, why doesn't Eng just water them twice a day or, put a sprinkler on a timer? Why is the soil composition itself considered such a fatal flaw here?
Because surface watering doesn't change the retention capacity of the infrastructure.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
We have to look at the physical composition of high drainage soil. It is engineered with large particles, things like coarse sand, perlite, or large pieces of bark.
Right, the chunky stuff.
Exactly. These large particles create what we call macropores, which are essentially large air pockets in the soil structure.
Which means gravity can pull the water down and out of the pot almost instantly.
Yes, exactly. And remember the context. During the moons of heavy downpours, those macropores were the only reason the plant survived.
Wait, didn't they just have moons of heavy downpours? So that high drainage was probably keeping those plants alive yesterday.
Oh, absolutely. If soil lacks drainage during heavy rain, water fills every microscopic gap, pushing all the oxygen out.
And the plant drowns.
The roots suffocate, rot sets in, and the plant drowns. So the high drainage soil was essentially a survival mechanism designed to shed water as violently as the sky was delivering it.
Okay, it's like a multi-lane highway built for maximum traffic flow.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If you are dealing with the rush hour of a monsoon, you need cars or water drops to move through the system at top speed to avoid a massive, catastrophic traffic jam.
You need them off the road as fast as possible.
It is a brilliant piece of engineering for a saturated environment. But today, it's exactly what's killing them. The moment the rain stops and the drop begins, you suddenly have a new problem.
You don't need a highway anymore.
Exactly. You no longer need to move traffic quickly. You need to store it. You need a parking lot. And a highway is a terrible place to try and park a car. It's like trying to hold water in a sieve.
The infrastructure becomes the active threat. In a hot, dry environment, those same macropores that save the plant from drowning now act as ventilation shafts. Yeah, they allow the scorching, dry air to penetrate deep into the root zone, evaporating what little moisture is left from the inside out. The environment changed, but the infrastructure cannot adapt on its own.
So Eng is stuck. The soil is effectively a sieve, accelerating the dehydration. But you can't exactly rip these established plants out of their pots to change the dirt right as a heat wave hits.
Definitely not.
I mean, pulling them out of the soil and exposing their roots to dry air to repot them would cause massive root shock, wouldn't it?
Repotting a stressed plant during a severe temperature transition is almost guaranteed to kill it.
Because the roots are too delicate.
Right. The root hairs, which are microscopic structures responsible for water uptake, would desiccate and die within minutes of exposure to the dry air.
Jeez.
So Eng has to change the physics of the soil without actually touching the soil itself.
Which brings us to the tactical adjustments. Because the previous survival tactic is now a liability.
Right, how do we pivot?
The journal outlines a two-pronged strategy to survive the impending dry, hot moons. First, significantly increase the watering frequency. But the second part is the real structural pivot. Eng starts deploying plant saucers beneath the pots.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a profound strategic reversal from water displacement to deliberate water retention.
Putting a cap on the sieve.
Think about the mechanics of capping a sieve. Exactly. By placing a saucer under a pot with high drainage soil, Eng is artificially altering the hydrology of that specific container.
I love this. It's like switching from a cash flow mindset, just letting water run through the system, to actively building an emergency savings account.
That's exactly what it is.
For you listening, think about what your equivalent of a plant saucer is when resources suddenly dry up in your own life or work. But wait, if sitting in water causes root rot, as we just established with the heavy downpours, why does putting a saucer of water under the plant suddenly become the solution?
It seems counterintuitive.
Aren't we just recreating the drowning hazard?
The context of the evaporation rate changes everything.
Okay, how so?
Well, during the monsoon, the soil was saturated, the air was saturated, and the water had nowhere to go. It stagnated.
Right.
In the dry heat of El Niño, the air is pulling moisture out of the plant leaves at a ferocious rate through a process called transpiration. The plant is desperately trying to pull water up from the soil to compensate.
So it's acting like a giant biological straw.
Exactly. And this is where capillary action comes into play.
Capillary action. Okay, break that down for us.
Capillary action is the ability of a liquid to flow in narrow spaces without the assistance of, or even in opposition to, external forces like gravity.
Even against gravity.
Yes. Water molecules like to stick together, that's cohesion, and they like to stick to other surfaces, that's adhesion.
Okay, so they climb.
Right. The high drainage soil refuses to hold the water when it's poured from the top. It rushes straight through into the saucer. But once the saucer is full, the dry soil matrix above it acts like a sponge.
Pulling it back up.
Through capillary action, it slowly pulls that captured moisture back up into the root zone, precisely as the plant transpires and demands it.
That is fascinating. The saucer is essentially a localized reservoir. It allows the plant to drink at its own pace throughout the baking heat of the day, rather than just getting a flash flood of water in the morning that instantly drains away.
Yes.
The saucer catches the runoff that the primary system refuses to hold.
It creates a buffer against the extreme environment. When the daily, abundant influx of rain stops, survival depends entirely on the capacity to capture and slowly distribute a localized reserve.
It is a massive shift in operating principles. But, adapting to this kind of severe environmental whiplash isn't just about what you actively start doing, like increasing the watering cadence or adding saucers.
Sometimes the most critical aspect of survival is recognizing what you must stop doing.
Right. Adapting is also about knowing what not to do. And the tactics for existing plants lead perfectly into Eng's stark warning about new growth.
The tactical shift for existing plants requires effort, but the strategy for new life requires restraint. In the final lines of this dispatch, Eng delivers a stark piece of operational advice.
The germination freeze.
Right. This impending El Niño is a terrible time for seed germination, particularly outdoors.
Eng specifically notes that the drier weather makes it incredibly difficult to achieve a high germination rate.
It's just too dry.
Let's look at the biology of that for a moment. Why is the surface of the soil the absolute worst place to be during a drought?
To understand the risk, we have to look at what a seed actually is. A seed is a marvel of evolutionary engineering. It is an embryo and a small food supply encased in an armored protective shell.
Okay.
As long as it remains dormant, it is highly resilient. It can survive intense heat, freezing cold, and prolonged drought. But germination is the biological point of no return.
Once it commits, there's no going back.
None. To break dormancy, a seed requires sustained, consistent moisture to swell up, split that armored shell, and send out a radicle. Yeah, which is the very first, incredibly fragile embryonic root.
And if that process starts, but the moisture suddenly vanishes?
The fragile new root desiccates and dies almost instantly. The seed has spent its entire energy reserve and failed to establish a connection to deeper soil.
Wow.
And where are seeds planted? In the top millimeter of the soil.
The exact place that is most exposed to the sun and the dry air.
Yes. The surface loses its moisture first. In the hot, dry moons of El Niño, keeping the very surface of the soil consistently moist enough to sustain that biological gamble is nearly impossible. The evaporation rate is simply too high.
So the germination rate, here's where it gets really interesting if we look at that as the return on investment.
The gardener's ROI.
Exactly. The return on the gardener's investment of time, seeds, and water just plummets. You might plant 100 seeds, water them constantly, fight the evaporation, and still only get 2 or 3 to successfully sprout and survive.
It's incredibly inefficient.
Attempting to force new beginnings, like outdoor seed germination, in a hostile, rapidly drying environment is a massive waste of potential.
It is the biological equivalent of launching a fragile new ship directly into a hurricane. The timing is fundamentally wrong. Eng recognizes that the ambient conditions have turned hostile to new growth.
It's a powerful lesson in the discipline of timing. Sometimes the smartest, most strategic thing you can do is hold your resources back.
Yes.
It is knowing the difference between the season to turtle up and protect the assets you already have, like giving the Brazilian spinach its capillary water saucer, versus the season where the environment is actually conducive to launching something new.
And Eng, writing entry number 901, possesses the long-term perspective necessary for that discipline. The journal notes that this heat wave will last for moons to come, but crucially it acknowledges that the monsoon season will eventually return at the end of the year.
It's not forever.
Exactly. The rains will come back. The atmospheric faucet will turn back on. That future season is the time for germination. The current mission is sheer preservation of existing life.
So let's look at the entire arc of this transition.
It's quite a journey.
We started with an environment and an infrastructure that was perfectly adapted to surviving moons of heavy downpours. The potting mix was engineered with large macro pores to guarantee high drainage, allowing water to rush through the systems so the plants wouldn't drown.
Then the macro-level forecast shifted, predicting the arrival of the El Niño phenomenon and a drastic pivot to a dry, scorching climate.
But rather than waiting for the heat wave to fully arrive, Aang monitored the localized early warning systems. The Brazilian spinach, exposed in its shallow pot, acted as the vital indicator, struggling as the ambient humidity dropped before the temperatures even peaked.
Recognizing that the high drainage infrastructure was transitioning from a vital survival mechanism into a fatal liability, Aang initiated a structural pivot.
The saucers.
By deploying plant saucers beneath the pots, the strategy inverted from rapid water displacement to deliberate water retention. The saucers capture the runoff, allowing the soil to utilize capillary action to slowly draw moisture back up to the roots during the heat of the day.
And finally, Aang exercised the biological discipline to hit pause on all new outdoor seed germination.
Restraint.
Recognizing that the top layer of soil would become a hostile, evaporating wasteland, the focus shifted entirely away from new growth and firmly onto preserving the established plants until the favorable monsoon conditions return.
Right.
It is a complete masterclass in reading microsignals, understanding the physical mechanisms of your environment, and dynamically adapting to rapid shifts. For you, listening, understanding the physics of your own landscape and knowing how to adjust your own drainage strategies is what separates a system that thrives from one that withers when the climate inevitably changes.
The mechanics of adaptation are universal. And as we conclude our analysis of this remarkable dispatch, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider.
I love this part.
If surviving extreme climatic whiplash requires completely reversing foundational practices like deliberately trapping water with saucers after months of engineering your soil to aggressively drain it away, it makes you wonder, what other high drainage systems have you built in your own life that are operating perfectly under today's conditions but will immediately become your greatest structural vulnerability the moment the environment shifts?